On today's field tips, we're going to be building some high FOC carbon arrows for bow hunting, so stick around. All right, so what we're going to be doing today is taking some pre-made arrows, pre-fletched shafts, and we're going to be trimming them to length, installing the inserts, and aligning the broadheads. Now, before we get started, I want to talk a little bit about some of the stuff that I've got up here and talk a little bit about FOC. Now, FOC is how far forward of center the balance point is. And so if I take this arrow, you can see that it's going to be balancing on my finger way far forward. So the center of the arrow is right here, the balance point is up here. The distance between that, the percentage of that total length of the shaft is FOC. Now, if you are not familiar with FOC, I'm going to link to another video up here in the top. I would highly recommend you go and look at that. It talks about all the benefits of having a high FOC arrow. It talks about how to calculate it. And then that video, we're actually going through the process of making some high FOC natural material arrows. But in this build, we're going to be working with carbon shafts, and when you're working with carbon, you've got a lot more leeway for manipulating FOC, and that's where all this stuff comes in. The first thing that I want to mention is this little test pack of field tips that I've got here. This came from Three Rivers, and it's got two 300 grain tips, two 250s, and two 200 grain tips. And so when you're working through building your arrow and working through the tuning process, this test kit comes in really handy to change tip weights really quickly so that you can get something that flies good out of your bow. Another thing I want to mention is these brass inserts. These are 50 grains a piece. The inserts that come with the shafts usually are just these little aluminum inserts, and they usually only weigh 10 to 12 grains. And so by going with a brass insert, first of all, you're getting something that's a little bit stronger, but secondly, you're increasing that tip weight just through your insert there. Now, one pretty cool little thing that comes from Gold Tip are these little weights that will screw into the back of your inserts. And these things are 50 grains a piece, and you can stack them on top of one another. You can put as many of these things on as you want. And so right now I just took that 50 grain insert and made it a 100 grain insert. And so you can see how you can use this not only to manipulate your FOC, but also to help with your tuning process. You know, if you've got an arrow that's spined a little bit stiff, you could try throwing another one of these on the back of your insert, and that might just correct that stiff arrow flight. Now, I've already gone through the entire process. I've built a single arrow, and I've tuned it to the bow that I'm going to be shooting this out of, and that's what this is right here. So now what I'm going to do is just go ahead and take the rest of these shafts, and I'm going to build this exact same arrow. Now, I don't typically shoot carbon arrows, and so I don't have a cutoff saw like they would have at the pro shops to trim these things. Luckily, you don't need that. All I'm going to use is a disc sander, the same sander that I use for making my wood arrows for doing the tip tapers and the knock tapers. You can use the same thing for trimming these carbon shafts. Now, one thing I want to mention about these pre-fletched shafts is when you get them from the box, it usually seems to me that they're fletched way too far forward. And so what I like to do is take a little bit off this backside, because I want these fletchings to be as far back as practical. And so I'll trim that rear so that when I have my fingers on the string, these fletchings are resting just in front of my finger. And if you have a glove on, or if you're shooting with a glove, you need to take that into consideration as well. But the reason I like to move those fletchings back is because the farther back they are on the shaft, the more leverage they have on the shaft as it's flying, and the better they are at doing their job. And so the first thing we're going to do is just trim a little bit off the back side of these shafts. We're going to have to pull the nocks out and move over to the belt sander. So I took a little Sharpie and just put this up against the arrow that I already built and just marked this thing so that I'll know exactly how far to trim this. Now you'll end up with this stuff here. Just flip it over. So if you're concerned about the end of your arrow being square, you can just take a little sanding block, put your arrow in your spinner, and just square that thing up. It usually doesn't take much. You can usually get them pretty square just on the sander. Go ahead and reinstall your knock. All right, so now we can trim the other end. So again, just go ahead and mark that thing. All right, so I've got all these shafts trimmed to the proper length, and then I went ahead and just put them on here with the sanding block and just kind of clean them up a little bit. Now, when you trim them like this with the disc sanders, a lot of times you'll get a bunch of carbon dust and stuff in here, and just sometimes you just got to tap them and kind of sling that stuff out. But before we put our inserts in there, you want to make sure you clean out the inside of these things so that you'll get good adhesion with your glue. And so I'm just taking a little bit of acetone on a Q-tip here and just cleaning out the inside of these things. All right, so I'm getting ready to put some inserts into these carbon shafts. Now, it's always a good idea just, again, to clean things up. You know, if you've been handling the inserts, go ahead and take a little acetone and wipe them off. Now, through the tuning process, I found the combination that works well for this arrow and the bow that I'm going to be shooting it out of is a 200 grain tip and a 50 grain brass insert. And so I don't need any of these extra weights that'll screw into the back of these things. Now, with these little weights, you can insert these things into the back of the shaft after they're already in the arrow. They make a little tool. It's like a long Allen key. You take the knock off, put these little weights on there, slip it all the way up there, and you can add these things after the arrows are built. And so if you want to shoot these out of a lighter weight bow or a bow that is just going to require a lower dynamic spine, you can lower that just by adding some of those weights later on. Now, I'm going to be using just a regular old ferrule-tight hot melt to put these inserts in these arrows. Now, a word of warning, Gold Tip says do not use hot melt for carbon shafts. But the reason they say that is because heat can damage the carbon. Now, if you are careful to not get the inserts too hot, hot melt will work just fine. And the reason that I'm using hot melt is because I want the ability to adjust these things later on to align my broadhead to be vertical when I'm when the arrow's on the string and I'm shooting my bow. And so what I'm going to do is just heat this thing up a little bit. I'm going to heat this hot melt up. I'm gonna put a little bit on there, and as long as you can hold this thing, as long as you can put your fingers on that insert, you're good to go. You don't need to worry about it being too hot. You certainly, as you're putting this thing in here and adjust it, you don't want to put any heat on this shaft at all. That'll ruin the shaft. It'll cause it to warp. But like I said, if you don't get it too hot, you're probably gonna be good. And I'm just keeping, this brass heats up really quickly. So I'm keeping my finger on that brass so I can feel how hot it is, because I don't want to get it too hot. When that hot melt starts to cool off a little bit, you can go ahead and pull off any excess that you've got on there. We'll move on to the next one. If you get it too hot, you don't want it so hot you can't hold your fingers on it, but as long as you can hold it. Just let that thing set up for just a second. You can go ahead and that glue will come off there really clean. All right, so now that we've got all of our inserts mounted in here, let's go ahead and screw some broadheads on here and see how they align with our knock. So I'm gonna go ahead and knock this arrow, and I'm gonna turn the shaft so that my cock feather's out, and then that one's actually aligned pretty doggone good the way it is. Let's do a different one. So some people like them horizontal, some like them vertical. I don't think it really matters a whole lot as long as they're all the same. So that one definitely needs some adjustment. So I'm going to turn my arrow so that my knock is adjusted right. And you can see that that broadhead is off at an angle like that. And so what I'm going to do is just take a Sharpie and put a little mark on the shaft right on the top. And now what we're going to do is just heat this ferrule up just to melt that hot melt. We're going to rotate that thing so that the broadhead comes in alignment with that mark. Now again, when you're doing this, make sure that you do not get this thing too hot, and make sure you keep the heat off of the shaft. Also, when you're heating up a broadhead like this, be very careful. Again, if you get it too hot, you're going to mess up your shaft, but you'll also take the temper out of their broadhead. So keep that in mind. You just want to heat it enough so that it starts to give. There we go. All right, now let's see how that looks. Went a little too far. That looks pretty good right there. All right, so now that we've got our broadheads in the proper alignment, we'll go ahead and spin test them and see that we don't have any wobble. And the easiest way to do this is go ahead and set up a spinner like this. And I've actually got another video showing you how to make these things. But I just take a piece of cardboard and put it right where the broadhead is just about contacting this thing. And this one's got some text on it, so it gives me some reference to see which way the broadhead, or how the broadhead is aligning with it. You can turn that thing and see that this arrow has got some wobble. And when I spin it on my hand, I can feel that wobble. And so what we're gonna do is, you can either take a little Sharpie and put a mark on this thing right where the tip of the broadhead comes in contact with it and use that as your reference, or you can use a piece of cardboard like this with some text and just pick out a letter, put that thing right on a letter, and just spin that shaft slowly, and you can see where that tip rotates in relation to that mark. Then all you have to do is bend the broadhead in, or push the broadhead in the opposite direction to align it. So all you got to do is put that thing on the table and just give it a little push. Put it back on your spinner, and that looks like that did the trick. And it's spinning really nice on my hand now. So that arrow is done and ready to hunt. All right guys, well if you're watching this video shortly after I release it, there's still a pretty good little while left in the hunting season, so I hope you get out there, get some time in the field, and have some good luck. And if you're not subscribed to the channel, you might want to think about doing that, because I'm uploading a new video every single week about bow hunting, bow building, arrow making, bushcraft. Who knows what we're going to get into this next year. We've got a lot of really cool stuff lined up. So with that, I'd like to thank everybody that signed up at patreon.com/Clay Hayes, and we'll see you next time.